Edward Stewart.
My lords, my lady, this appeal has now come down to a single issue, namely whether or not HHJ discloses a longitudinal load moment control system, which is disabled when the vehicle is stationary. Of course, in order to determine that, one has to first understand what is meant by a longitudinal load moment.
You said disabled when stationary. You mean disabled
Sorry,
when
disabled
moving?
when stationary. Sorry, did I say disabled when? Sorry, disabled when the vehicle is moving.
Yes. Thank you.
It is first necessary to understand what is meant by a longitudinal load moment control system, which is essentially a matter of construction, and second, to identify the longitudinal load moment control system in HHJ, which is essentially a question of the disclosure of HHJ. And before I start, just on moments themselves, they are actually dealt with in the technical primer on pages 66 to 69. I don't think it's necessary to take you there, but I just mention that's where they are considered. So as far as the patent is directed to a method of operating vehicles or working machines to the language of the patent, such as telehandlers, which have an arm or boom that can extend forwards and upwards from the vehicle and which can be fitted with various attachments, for example, to lift and move loads. As the patent explains at paragraph 2, and you find that in the behind tab 1 of the supplemental on page 2, the longitudinal load moment control system is a system which automatically prevents operation of the arm in a manner which can increase longitudinal instability of the machine beyond a safe limit and hence prevents the machine from tipping forward. It's a safety system and it operates to prevent the machines from tipping by preventing further movement of the arm if the detected load moment exceeds a predetermined threshold.
Sorry, are you reading that from the detected load moment?
No, sorry.
No.
I was reading initially in paragraph 2, which is the definition of longitudinal load moment control system. And the definition there is, what's said there is that it automatically prevents operation of the working arm, at least in a manner which could increase the longitudinal instability of the machine beyond a safe limit.
Yes.
And in the context of this patent, it does so to prevent the machines from tipping by preventing further movement of the arm if the detected load moment exceeds a predetermined threshold. And what's explained at paragraph 5 is that when travelling on uneven terrain, the control system of the vehicle may be subjected to transient forces which indicate longitudinal instability and thus may prevent movement of the arm, when in actual fact the machine was not at risk of tipping and the immobilisation of the arm was therefore unnecessary. In other words, on uneven terrain, the transient forces can interfere with the measurement of the moment, producing inaccurate values, which may result in the arm being unnecessarily immobilised. In short, the sensing or detecting of the actual moment on uneven terrain can be inaccurate. The description of the invention begins at paragraph 7. The paragraph begins with a general description of the vehicle or machine, and the longitudinal load moment control system of that vehicle is introduced at line 8 of column 2. And this is said to be, at lines 8 to 13, functional automatically to disable the operation of the first and or second actuator devices where such movement would increase longitudinal instability in the event that a predetermined machine longitudinal instability is sensed. And just breaking that down a little bit, the longitudinal load moment control system is sensing or detecting the actual longitudinal load moment, and if that actual moment exceeds the threshold moment, the system operates to automatically prevent movement of the arm, thus preventing further longitudinal instability and stopping the machine from tipping over. And at lines 13 to 18 of paragraph 8, the method is said to be characterised in that the method includes a sensing parameter relating to the travelling speed of the machine on the ground, and where the machine is determined to be travelling at a speed above a threshold speed, disabling the longitudinal moment control system. So the method also detects or senses the travelling speed of the machine. And if that speed is above a threshold, which may be 0 kilometres per hour, it disables the load moment control system. And so the system is disabled when the vehicle is moving. And the benefits of the invention are explained at paragraph 8. During loading and unloading operations when the machine is stationary, the moment control system is operative and will act to prevent further movement of the arm if the actual longitudinal load moment is sensed or detected to be above the threshold. But the system is disabled when the vehicle is moving, preventing transient forces from unnecessarily immobilising the arm when the machine is not in fact at risk of tipping. The inventive concept of the patent is therefore a method of operation of a working vehicle in which, when stationary, a longitudinal load moment control system is operational, whereby the actual load moment is measured and the arm immobilised if the measured value exceeds a threshold. But when the vehicle is moving and the actual load moment is at risk of being inaccurately measured, the load moment control system is disabled, preventing inaccurate data from unnecessarily disabling the arm. And that's the construction that I've set out at paragraph 18 of my skeleton argument. So essentially, one's looking for a system in which the actual load is being determined and that system is disabled when the vehicle is in motion. Moving on to the disclosure of IHE 1. IHE 1 describes arguably a slightly more complex safety system, which it describes as an operation control device in, for example, claim 1 on page 17, or an operation limitation device, as we see in claim 2 on page 18. And a quick apology, I think that at various points in my skeleton I've referred to the operation control device as the operational control device. It's in fact the operational control device. And that operation control device of IHE comprises two subsystems or modes. The first is referred to as a working range limitation device, and the second, a moment limitation device. The limitation of the boom or arm is said, the operation of the boom or arm is, the limitation of the boom operation is said to be performed by the moment limitation means when the vehicle is stationary, and the working range limitation means when the vehicle is in motion. Now, the working range limitation device is described at paragraphs 3 to 4 of IHE. It detects the actual position of the work platform and ensures that the position of the work platform is kept within the permissible working range. The permissible working range being predetermined on the basis of a maximum permissible load. In other words, the working range limitation device assumes that the platform is carrying its maximum permitted load and determines the safe footprint within which the platform can safely be moved based on that maximum load. Further details are provided in paragraph 26 on page 27. The disadvantage of the working range limitation device, as IHE explains towards the end of paragraph 5, at the very bottom of page 19 and 20, is that where the platform is in fact carrying less than the maximum load, the permissible working range is less than the actual safe working range, but because the machine is nonetheless limited to the permissible working range, it is limited to a working footprint that is in fact smaller than the actual safe working footprint. And so the movement of the platform in those circumstances may be unduly restricted. And one can immediately see the consequence of not, one can immediately see that is the consequence of not measuring the actual moment. Because the device is measuring the position of the platform only and comparing it with a deemed, and combining it with a deemed load value, it is not measuring the actual stability, and this has the drawback of providing the more restricted footprint in which the continued operation of the device is deemed to be safe, as opposed to the actual potential larger actual safe operating footprint. By contrast, the moment limitation device, as we see back in paragraph 5, detects the actual overturning movement acting on the vehicle from the arm or boom. And it does this by detecting the hoist angle of the boom together with the actual tension or pressure of the hoisting cylinder. And if we pick it up again at paragraph 25, we can see that the hoist angle is detected by the hoist angle sensor, and that the actual tension is detected by the hoisting cylinder. And that detected data is used to determine the actual moment acting on the vehicle, which is given as MR, and that is compared with the predetermined maximum permissible moment, MA. And that limits operation of the boom where the actual moment MR exceeds the permissible moment MA. And going back to paragraph 5, that has the advantage as it said, there is the advantage that it is possible to move the work platform over the largest range of movement possible according to the load on the work platform at this time, as the overturning moment found corresponds to the actual load on the work platform. So the problem that Aichi seeks to solve is set out at paragraph 6, and that is that, picking it up at line 4 of that paragraph, additional vibrational force due to the vibration of movement acts on the boom and work platform, and the detected axial tension of the hoisting cylinder varies under the influence of this vibration. When the overturning moment is found using axial tension, which varies in this way, the overturning moment will also vary, with the difficulty that the moment limitation cannot be accurately controlled. And its proposed solution is set out at paragraph 9. That the machine is fitted with a control device which has both a moment limitation means detecting the overturning moment acting on the vehicle from the boom and the work platform, and also a working range control means which detects the position of the work platform or the apex of the boom from the operation of the boom, and a switching means which governs between limitation by the moment limitation means and limitation by the working range control means. And the switch is made to limitation of the boom by the movement limitation means using switching means where it has been detected that the vehicle is stationary. So the switch switches the mechanism between movement limitation means when the machine is stationary, and working range control means when the machine is in motion. And on that basis, we say that, in essence, Aichi and the patent therefore effectively identify substantially the same problem, that is, the elimination of the difficulties caused when the vehicle is moving by the influence of vibrational forces, to use the language of Aichi, or transient forces, to use the language of the patent, on the responses of sensors which sense and respond to actual moment, actual longitudinal instability of the vehicle when it's in use. And both Aichi and the patent also disclose substantially the same solution to this problem, even though those solutions are implemented slightly differently. In the patent, when the motion sensor senses that the vehicle is moving, the longitudinal load moment control system is disabled, thus eliminating the difficulties associated with the influence of transient forces. Once that system is disabled, there is no alternative automated system disclosed in the patent, which will prevent further detected data being used to determine the actual moment acting on the vehicle. Sorry. Start again. I've read from my skeleton to my note. I haven't carried over the page, sorry. So if I start again, sorry. In the patent, when the motion sensor senses that the vehicle is moving, the longitudinal load moment control system is disabled, eliminating the difficulties associated with the influence of transient forces on the response to the system. And once that system is disabled, there is no further automated safety operation in effect. In Aichi, when the motion sensor senses that the vehicle is moving, the moment limitation device is disabled to eliminate the difficulties associated with the influence of vibrational forces on the system. However, in Aichi, an alternative automated system is then kicked into operation within the wider operation control device, namely the working range limitation device, and that then becomes operative to prevent further movement, further operation of the arm when the permitted instability parameter values are exceeded based on the position of the platform. Now, if one goes to the judgment, and sees what the judge found, this is at tab 6 of the core bundle. And if I can pick it up, please, at paragraph 86. Paragraph 86, the judge held, thus, when the vehicle starts to move, the control over arm movement switches from moment limitation to working range limitation. That is plainly supported by the disclosure of Aichi and is not disputed by the experts. The judge also held that he finds it impossible to interpret this in any other way, as at the moment limitation device is disabled when the vehicle starts to move. Again, we say that that was a finding that the judge was perfectly entitled to make. At paragraph 90, the judge concludes at the end, towards the end of that paragraph, the moment limitation device is disabled as soon as the vehicle starts to move. In effect, the threshold speed for that disablement is 0. And again, we say that those findings are perfectly apparent from the disclosure of Aichi and also consistent with the evidence that was given by the experts. And just pausing there, we say that that is enough. Those findings alone are enough to support the judge's finding that Claim 1 was obvious over Aichi, because the judge has found a longitudinal load moment control system in Aichi 1, which is the moment limitation device, and he has found that that device is disabled when the vehicle starts to move. And that, we say, is sufficient to fall within the scope of Claim 1. Now, moment limitation device is, we say, a load moment control system within the meaning of the claim, because it measures the actual load moment acting on the vehicle, and the moment limitation device is disabled when the vehicle is moving. Aichi discloses a vehicle with such a moment control system falling within claim 1. And we don't actually understand that to be disputed. The working range limitation of Aichi is, we say, not a longitudinal load moment control system, because it is not measuring the actual load moment. It is only measuring the position of the platform. And as to the operation control device of Aichi, so the overall system, we say that that is not in and of itself a longitudinal load moment control system, because it is not always capable of measuring the actual load moment when in operation. It does so when operating in the moment limitation device mode, but it does not when operating in the working range limitation device mode. So although one might think of the operation control device as acting as a load moment control system when operating in the moment limitation device, it is not doing so when operating as the working range limitation device. And as the moment limitation device is, as seems common ground, to be disabled when the vehicle is moving, Aichi discloses a longitudinal load moment control system falling within the claim. The patent is concerned with load moment control systems which measure the actual load moment when the vehicle is moving, and which measurement is switched off or disabled when the vehicle is moving. And that is because it is only those moment control systems, i.e. those that measure the actual moment, that are at risk of inaccurate measurements in motion that may unnecessarily immobilise the arm. The moment limitation device of Aichi is precisely such a moment control system, and that moment control system is disabled when the vehicle is in motion. It doesn't matter, we say, what happens when that system is disabled. It doesn't matter if another system kicks in, and it doesn't matter whether or not, if another system kicks in, that other system is also a load moment control system falling within the claim or not. For completeness, we say that the working range device system is not an longitudinal load moment control system, because it doesn't in fact measure the moment. But even if it was, we'd say it doesn't matter. So in essence, we say that the judge was perfectly entitled to come to the findings that he did on the basis of the evidence before him. As to the evidence that
I just ask,
yeah.
sorry, forgive me. I understand the point you're making, you just made, is you say that the working range limitation device is not a longitudinal load moment thing, but even if it is, you say it doesn't matter. I get that. Of those two options, which one did the judge go for?
The second.
In other words, he was deciding from the basis that it was a load, that the working range was a load, longitudinal load.
No, sorry, I may have misunderstood what you were asking by 1 and 2. As I understand it, what the judge found is he found that Aichi discloses a longitudinal load moment control system, and he says that is what he says at paragraph 81. And when he comes to paragraph 86, he explains that the control over arm movement switches from moment limitation to working range limitation, and he finds it impossible to interpret this in any other way than that the moment limitation device is disabled when the vehicle starts to move. So therefore, as I understand it, what the judge has focused on is he's focused on the moment limitation device within Aichi, and has found that that is a longitudinal load moment control system within the patent, and that is disabled. as I understand the judgment, he hasn't actually turned his attention to whether or not the second element of Aichi, i.e. the working range control device, is or is not.
I see, thank you.
And we say he was perfectly entitled to do that because if, as he found and as he rightly found, the moment limitation device is indeed a longitudinal load moment control system and it is indeed disabled on movement, then that is enough for Aichi to fall within claim 1.
You said at one stage that it was only systems which measured the actual moment, which were longitudinal load moment control systems. I think, if I've got this right, within the meaning of the patent.
Within the meaning of the patent.
That is based on the fact that the problem identified by the patent is the problem of false readings.
Exactly.
And you can't have a false reading if you're not reading.
Correct.
So does it follow that the working range limitation bit of Aichi, and I'm avoiding the question whether that's a separate system or a separate way of operating the same system, but it definitely operates in a different way.
Yes.
Whether or not one might describe it as a moment control system, because it does control the extendability of the boom and so on. It stops you from extending the boom. So to that extent, it controls the moment of the machine. Doesn't matter because it's not a moment control system of the type that the patent is interested in. Is that?
That's exactly correct. So we say that the patent is interested in longitudinal load moment control systems which detect actual load, which detect actual moments, because it is the detection of the actual real-time moment which is subject to giving false measurements in movement, particularly on unruly terrain, and that is the problem which is being solved by the disablement of that control system. If the control system was operational other than by detecting actual loads, it would not need to be disabled when it was in motion, because whatever it was measuring would not be subjected to errors as a result of the transient forces or vibration forces. As vibration forces as used by Aichi, transient forces as used by the patent, associated with traversing on uneven ground.
Okay, thank you.
And so if you had what Aichi describes as a working range control device, you wouldn't be getting the benefit of the patent by disabling it in motion, because it is equally effective in motion and when stationary.
Sorry, you'll have to say that again.
So insofar as one is looking at a longitudinal, insofar as one is looking at, for example, the working range control device of Aichi, where one is simply measuring the position of the platform and combining that with a predetermined estimate of your load or predetermined value for your load, there is no advantage in disabling that mechanism when the vehicle is in motion, because the sensing that is taking place to determine the position of the platform is not affected by false readings as a result of bumping across uneven terrain. And therefore you are not at risk of having abrupt stops when you're moving, if that is the nature of the control device that you are using. And it is for that reason that we say that the patent is concerned with moment control systems which are measuring the actual moments, because those are the measurements that are subjected to inaccuracies on movement.
When you say both the patent and Aichi are concerned with the same problem,
They're both concerned with
which is the false readings.
Exactly.
And so they're both concerned with a problem thrown up only if you're measuring the actual
Correct.
something, not necessarily the load, because Aichi, I think, proceeds on the basis that what you in fact measure is the pressure in the hydraulic cylinder.
Indeed, but if you are concerned with measuring parameters from which you can derive
Yes.
the actual moment, then it is those parameters that are likely to give false readings when you are in motion, particularly so on uneven terrain.
And I think Aichi explains that pressure is one of the parameters which is affected by vibrational bumpy terrain.
And so both of them,
Forgive me, if you're going to get there later, fine. But I would like to know which words of the claim you say are the words on which that construction of the claim hangs, if there are any. And if you're going to do it later, do it.
No, I might as well do it right now. If I go to, I will pick up the claim as in Mr. Silverleaf skeleton argument, which I put. So if we look at paragraph 8 on page 18, and the bits that I rely on are, so I rely on the combination of H as amended, so which is functional, automatically disable the operation of the first and or second actuator device, which would increase longitudinal instability. But I predominantly rely on the remainder of I, which is in the event that a predetermined machine longitudinal instability is sensed. So I rely on the language of the claim whereby longitudinal instability is actually being sensed. And the disablement of the longitudinal load moment control system. I rely on the description of the sensors, including that they can be arranged on the rear axle, and the purported benefit, which is given in the characterizing portion, which is that that system is disabled when the machine is moving. And of course, the only that is only a benefit in circumstances where you are disabling something to prevent faulty readings, and the faulty readings are the sensing of the actual data, which gives rise to calculations of the actual moment.
Thank you.
Now, our position is that the judge was entitled to come to those findings on the basis of the evidence before him. Mr. Silverleaf took you in some detail to the evidence of both of the witnesses, both their evidence in chief and their evidence in cross-examination. As we understand it, that evidence is relied on by JCB, not in fact to challenge the findings that the judge made that we rely on, that I've taken you to, which were self-evidently open to the judge on the basis of the material before him, but rather to criticise the judge for not making additional or different findings which support the position that JCB wish to argue as to the construction. Now, we don't accept that, but we also say it doesn't matter because none of the judge's actual findings can be impugned by the evidence that you were taken to this morning when that evidence is understood in context. Now, I'm happy to go through that and explain why that is if you would like me to.
Yes, I think we would like that. Thank you.
I'll try and do it as briefly as is possible, but we can start with the evidence in chief of Mr. Plummer.
Professor, I think.
Professor, oh, I'm so sorry, Professor Plummer. Apologies to Professor Plummer.
It's not very precious, I don't think he'd mind at all.
And in particular, his evidence at paragraph 6.34, which is on 126 of the supplemental bundle behind tab 5. And what he says here is that the most striking difference between the patent and what is described in Aichi is that in contrast to the method described in Aichi in the patent, Aichi does not disclose disabling the moment control system when the machine is determined to be travelling at a speed above a threshold. Rather, when the controller of Aichi detects that the machine is in motion, it switches from a moment limitation mode to a working range control mode. And he goes on to say that the working range control system is just as much a moment control system as the moment limitation system of Aichi. So what he seems to be saying in paragraph 6.34 is that he accepts that Aichi describes a system whereby control is switched from moment limitation mode to working range control mode. And you see those two terms are in inverted commas. That's the actual language that's used in Aichi. And he then goes on to say that in his view, the working range control system is just as much a moment control system, which is his phraseology here, as the moment limitation system of Aichi. But that's a different point. He doesn't suggest in this paragraph that the moment limitation mode is not switched to a working control mode, i.e. which the judge interprets as is disabled and then replaced by a working range control mode. His evidence in para 6.34 is rather different. His evidence in paragraph 3.64 is that in his view, the moment limitation mode and the working range control mode of Aichi are both moment control systems. But that doesn't mean that he's not saying...
Just to interrupt you, I'm sorry. I think Mr. Silverleaf said that statement wasn't cross-examined, and indeed the other expert said in chief that described in chief the working range control bit as an LMC, a load moment control. So there doesn't seem to be no dispute about that. And you're now inviting us to take a different view.
No, not at all. I'm not inviting you to find that there is a dispute there.
I thought you did say that it wasn't a longitudinal load moment control system as defined in the pattern because it didn't measure the actual load.
That is my position. But what I'm just exploring here is what the experts have said.
Yes.
And what Professor Plummer is saying in paragraph 6.34 is not inconsistent with the judge's finding, which is that the moment limitation device of Aichi is switched to the working range control device of Aichi when the system is moving. And the judge says he finds it hard to interpret that as being anything other than the disablement of the moment limitation device in favour of the working range control device. That's the finding of the judge. We say that that is not inconsistent with what is being said here. What is being said here by
The judge thought it was. Look at paragraph 86.
Well, but this is exactly the point, that this is what the judge has just found here is entirely consistent with the first part of Professor Plummer's evidence that I was just drawing your attention to, which is that Professor Plummer explains that in Aichi, as is common ground, in fact, from the disclosure of Aichi, as is clear, rather, from the disclosure of Aichi itself, one switches from moment limitation device to the working range limitation device. And the judge says, I find it impossible to interpret this in any other way than the moment limitation device is disabled when the vehicle starts to move. And that is, I say, entirely consistent with what Professor Plummer has said at paragraph 6.34. Professor Plummer goes on to say that in his view, both the moment limitation device and the working range control devices are, to use his language, moment control systems. Now we say, as a matter of construction, they are not longitudinal load moment control systems within the meaning of the patent. But ultimately, that doesn't matter because it is common ground, as explained by Professor Plummer, and I'll show you the evidence of Professor Cryam, that the moment limitation device is disabled when the vehicle starts to move, and that actually is what matters. As far as the cross-examination of Professor Plummer is
just before you leave what he says in chief, does it make any difference whether you describe this as two systems or one system with two modes, or as you've tended to do, two devices? Is that of any significance, how you describe it? I think Mr. Silverleaf placed some reliance on the fact that you have one control box that switches from one mode to another mode, but it just uses slightly different inputs, but still doing the same thing.
Well, when it is correct to say that it uses different inputs. It is correct to say that at one level of abstraction, they are both doing the same thing. They are both preventing the machine from overturning, from tipping over.
And they do that by limiting the ability of the actuator to extend the arm any further.
That is also correct. But what they are measuring and the consequences of those measurements and the extent to which the movement of the arm is limited is different in the two systems.
Again, you've used the phrase two systems as if that's a given, but does it make a difference whether you characterize this as two systems or one system with two different modes? That was my question.
Oh, well, the patent requires a longitudinal load moment control system.
Yep.
I say that, and using strictly the language of Aichi now, I say that the moment limitation device of Aichi, without any other aspects of the
Does
Aichi
Aichi
control
use the
system,
word device?
it uses working range control device, and that is operated by the working range control means. Do you want to see that?
I'd like to see the word device, I
Yeah.
think.
So we see that in if you have Aichi open on page 17 of the bundle, so tab 2 of supplemental, and you see in the title we have operation control device. That's the overall control system. And
Yeah.
that language then appears at the very beginning of claim 1 at the bottom of page 17, an operation control device. And that is comprised of, at the top of page 18, a moment limitation means and a working range control means.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
It doesn't say a moment limitation device and a working range
So-
control
so it-
device.
So it does, because when you
it
then
does. I
when you
wouldn't-
then go on,
Yes.
you
thank
see that exact language is being used at
3.
paragraph 25, where you have the moment limitation device, which is defined as 20A, and
I
in
see.
paragraph 26 you have the work limitation device, which is 20B.
I see. And
So-
you say the moment limitation device in 20A is is an LMCS as
Yes.
defined in the patent,
Correct.
but the work range limitation device is not.
It's not.
So since it's common ground that you switch from 1 to 2, you say you necessarily switch off
Correct.
the first one.
Correct. So
And that is disclosing what's in the patent. That's what you say.
so for me it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
Where it matters is that if, as I think is Mr. Silverleaf's position, you take the entire operation control device, so the totality with both modes, and all you are doing is moving between two modes, and both of those modes are, he says, capable of acting as longitudinal load moment control systems, then he says nothing is being disabled. The system isn't being disabled when you move. You're just switching between one operating mode and a separate
Yes.
operating mode.
Yeah.
So that's the difference.
Thank you.
So that was Professor Plummer, apologies, in chief, and the cross-examination that was relied on is at page 246 of the supplemental bundle behind tab 9. And picking it up on page 170 at line 12, he was asked, then in order to apply the right stability system in accordance with this design, Aichi teaches having a motion detector decide whether the vehicle is stationary or in motion, and then switching one system off and the other one on, and vice versa, as often and when required. Agreed? Yes. And picking it up again at the top of 171, just at line 2, just what we can see we have here. Right in the middle, we have a box 20 controller, which within it has two separate parts, the moment limitation part and the work range limitation part. Agreed. And the witness agreed at line 6. And so those two bits of his oral evidence that I've just taken to you are again consistent with a distinction being drawn as between the moment limitation device and the working range control device of Aichi. as being separate systems, the moment limitation device being switched off when the vehicle is moving and the working range control device being switched on, and vice versa when the machine is stationary. And I say that none of that evidence really moves the dial in terms of the findings that the judge made, which is the judge found that the moment limitation device is switched off, i.e. disabled, when the vehicle is moving. As far as Mr. Crime's evidence in chief is concerned, you were taken to, I think it was paragraph 325.
Yes.
And what's said at paragraph 325 is that the skilled person knew of the limitations of LMCs when the machine was in motion, as he's described above. And so now, talking about Aichi, a system which took account of this and which switched off the load moment limitation system when moving, but replacing it with a range limitation system would have been of real interest to the skilled person and would fully comply with the requirements of EN 15,000. And so I don't see that evidence of Mr. Graham as suggesting either that the load moment limitation device is not switched off when the vehicle is moving, nor do I see him as saying that the range, insofar as it matters, do I see that evidence as him saying that the range limitation system was itself a separate longitudinal load moment system control.
Well, he does say, additionally providing an optimized LMC during machine movement, and he must have defined LMC as a load moment control.
Page, para 78, page 161.
Thank you.
But,
You've done your homework.
but ultimately, yeah.
So your submission must rest on a distinction between what Mr. Graham meant by a load moment control system, LMC, and what the patent meant by an LMMC
Absolutely.
system.
So as far as the patent is concerned, we say that the patent is exclusively concerned with those systems which are vulnerable to false measurements when in motion. And those are the types of systems that are measuring actual loads. And so as far as the patent is concerned, we say that there is a distinction. There is a distinction there. And for completeness, we were then, the final part of the evidence that you were taken to was the cross-examination of Mr. Crime. And I think it's easiest to pick that up in the judgment, as the section is largely complete. And what the judge says about the first part of that evidence at paragraph 88, he says that the proposition that was put to Mr. Crime is not quite correct. When the vehicle moves, it switches to a system which uses the methodology as described by counsel, but it is not the same methodology. When stationary, the system measures the actual load moment acting on the vehicle against a permissible limit. Mr. Graham may have been trying to state the correct position, but his answer was cut off. Now, just pausing there, what, in fact, Mr. Graham was being asked in this passage, Mr. Silverleaf was explaining, was he was trying to confer, he was seeking to establish with Mr. Graham that both of the different systems used in Aichi were what Mr. Silverleaf refers to as envelope control systems. With respect, I don't think that actually takes things any further forward in terms of the questions that the judge had to ask. Finding another level of abstraction at which the two systems or devices may be considered to be similar doesn't deal with the fundamental question of whether or not the moment limitation device is an LLMC within the meaning of the claim. And therefore, whether or not Mr. Silverleaf is correct in saying that the judge that the judge was wrong in thinking that the proposition was incorrect doesn't actually matter, insofar as it wasn't suggested by Mr. Silverleaf either this morning that what he had intended or what he was seeking to extract from Mr. Graham was a distinction, was a confirmation that both the moment limitation device and the working range control device were exactly the same in all material respects, because clearly they are not. And if they were, there would be no need to move between one to the other. The fact is that they are similar at various levels of abstraction, which may or may not include whether or not they fall within Mr. Silverleaf's definition of envelope control. But what actually matters is whether or not they are longitudinal load moment control systems within the meaning of the patent, and that proposition is not touched by the cross-examination that we see either at paragraph 87 or at paragraph 88. And so for those reasons, we say that the evidence that was relied on by Mr. Silverleaf this morning is insufficient to impugn the judge's findings that he made at paragraphs 81 through to paragraph 90, and the conclusion that he made on the basis of that evidence, namely that the patent is obvious over Aichi because Aichi does describe a longitudinal load moment control system which is disabled when the vehicle is moving. And unless I can assist you any further, that is all I have to say.
I do have a question. The submissions you're making, Mr. Stewart, involve a point on the interpretation of the claim, the construction of the claim.
Correct.
It's not obvious to me that the judgment recognises that there is a point on construction of the claim of that kind anyway. I haven't spotted it. I don't know if... So
No.
One question is, have you spotted it and I've just missed it?
No, well, one of the oddities, and
Well, can I just... So that was the first. I just wanted to check
Yeah.
that I hadn't missed something. The question is, because you weren't there, I don't know, do you have any of the papers in this case other than the one you...
no, I've got the supplemental bundle and the core bundle.
Well, I'm just puzzled, really. Yeah, anyway.
But I would just make one observation, and that's that the judge has set out what he understood to be the disputes on construction at paragraphs 68
Yes.
through to 71. And they don't, in fact, cover this point at all. In fact, he says that both parties said there was a point of construction and both identified different points, none of which was this point.
Which is this, yes.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the points he says it's a little bit confusing because Aichi uses specific language and terminology, operation control device, moment limitation device, working range control device, moment limitation means, working range control means. The patent uses longitudinal load moment control systems. That terminology doesn't appear in Aichi. The terminology in Aichi doesn't appear in the patent. And it's not always clear, particularly from Mr. Silverleaf's skeleton argument, which of the terms is being referred to, because sometimes they're being replaced with more generalised terms. And therefore it's quite difficult, but it doesn't seem to me, we say that notwithstanding any of that, that the judge appears to have been entitled to come to the findings that he has done, and he's clear in his summary, in his summary of Aichi, he uses the language of Aichi, and in his summary of the patent, he uses the language of the patent, and he seems to be perfectly happy that the moment limitation device, as described in Aichi, is for all intents and purposes a longitudinal load moment control system within the meaning of the patent.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to find on the material that I have that there was any further specific dispute as to what that term meant other than in the context of longitudinal. But as for the load moment control system, I haven't been able to detect any dispute.
But presumably what you're saying is that the judge's approach is consistent with your submissions about the construction of the two patterns.
Indeed, and I say, and is not inconsistent with any of the evidence that was
Yeah.
given by the experts.
Can I just be sure I've understood that? The question of construction you put before us was that in the terminology of the patent, a longitudinal load moment control system is only one which measures an input which is affected potentially by vibrations arising from going over rough terrain. Vibrations in movement.
Correct.
Well, as I understood your argument, actually we don't need to decide. The judge doesn't deal with this, as you've just explained to my lord, in terms. But as I understood your argument, we don't need to decide that point of construction. All we need to decide is that whatever the ambit or scope of longitudinal load moment control system as used in the patent, the moment limitation device in Aichi is one of those things. Because your case is, on the evidence, the judge was entitled, indeed right, to find that it was common ground that Aichi switches from the moment limitation device to something else. Again, we don't need to decide whether the something else is an LLMCS as defined or not. All we need to be satisfied of is that the judge was entitled to say, when you switch from A to B, you've stopped using A. That's it.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
So this question of construction of claim 1 of the patent might be something that we don't have to decide.
I agree with my lord, if I may say so, but can I just add another layer, which I'd be interested if you have any submissions you want to make about it, Elisabeth Stewart. I think Mr. Silverleaf's answer to that, one of his answers is, or could be, because that's part of what he opened to us on this appeal, is another point of construction of the claim, which is referable to para 37 of the patent, which we were shown.
Yes.
And the point of paragraph 37 is that it explicitly states that not only that the controller disables the longitudinal load moment control system, but also that permits the operator to operate the actuating devices at will. And so he develops that and says, look, what's happening there is to be understood as meaning that if you take that, for now, say that's something which the claim should be achieving. Now, one say these aren't the words of the claim, but never mind, leave that to one side for a minute. What that's telling you is that the function required by the claim is that any system which would prevent the person from operating the actuated devices at will is what has to be disabled. Have you got anything you want to say about that?
Well, only that it's, although it's said at paragraph 37 that the operator is free to operate the device at will, it's also said towards the end of paragraph 8, so this is picking it up, page 2 of the bundle, line 30, in paragraph 8, it says, even though the longitudinal load movement control system may be disabled, the load movement indicator will still continue to provide a visual indication to the operator of the longitudinal stability status of the machine. So that's anticipating. Now, obviously, the load movement indicator is providing a visual signal of impending instability. It is not providing an automated cut-off of the machine. But we say that that indicates that it is not anticipating that other devices, other safety mechanisms can be included, can be introduced. But the thrust of the patent, the inventive concept of the patent, is that those mechanisms that operate by detecting actual moments, those mechanisms are disabled.
Thank you very much.
Basically, as far as I can see, this case comes down to whether the claim is to be interpreted as limited in the way that Ms. Edwards-Stewart has suggested, or whether when it talks about a longitudinal load moment control system, it means anything that inhibits the movement of the machine in a direction that would increase longitudinal instability. We say the latter, she says the former. The problem with the former is that that's not what the legislation thinks, and it's not what the patent thinks, because the patent cross-refers to the legislation. The legislation talks about systems that prevent the machine from being moved beyond the allowable limits. There's no, beyond a predetermined limit. I'll show you in just a moment. There's no suggestion that how you decide what those limits are is to be specified by the legislation, and it's just a matter of engineering design. The patent in paragraph 2 specifically cross-refers to the legislation when it says it is a statutory requirement, at least in Europe, for such machines to be provided with a longitudinal load moment control system which automatically prevents operation of the working arm, at least in a manner which could increase longitudinal instability of the machine beyond a safe limit. Now, if you then go to the legislation, which is at tab 3, page 51 of the, well, if you start it behind tab 3 at page 44, you see the cover of BSEN 15,000. Page 51, you get the terms and definitions. And you've got LLMI at 3.2 and LLMC at 3.3, both of which simply talk about, in the first case, increase the longitudinal load moment beyond predetermined limits for an indicator, and for the control, changing the geometry in directions which would increase the longitudinal load moment beyond the allowable limits. The proposition that we are concerned here only with systems that directly measure load is, in my respectful submission, simply wrong. There's nothing in the patent to say that. And the fact that that is how it is routinely done is simply the way the engineers have chosen to do it.
Does it make any difference that the problem is identified in the patent as being the false readings, and that is only a problem if you're actually reading?
No, because what the patent is doing is saying, I've got to have some kind of control system. You could have a control system which assumed maximum load all the time, but that would limit the capacity of the machine quite unnecessarily. So you obviously don't want to do that. And what the patentee is saying is you can limit, you can have a much less restrictive control system, but in order to make it work better, you have to do this to it as well. So the idea that these control systems are defined to work in a particular way is not something that you can draw out of the patent, certainly not something you can draw out of the patent in the context of the legislative requirements. What you're getting here is an engineer saying, this is how best to achieve the requirements of the statute using this particular method. And it doesn't mean, you don't have to use absolutely exactly what I'm doing, but here's an idea. And the idea is turn the control system off when the machine is moving. Now, almost any system may be affected by vibration and movement, so it might be a good idea to apply it to other systems. The fact that it's being applied in that specific context, in the specific example, particular examples, is neither here nor there. The next point I wanted to make is, as my Lord Justice Birss pointed out, the whole point is that the specification says turn this off. So it doesn't limit the movement. Aichi does not turn off the control system. And with the greatest respect to the controller's argument, what Professor Plummer was saying in 634 in his evidence was Aichi has a load moment control, longitudinal load moment control system in operation at all times. It just uses different inputs and is therefore more restrictive when the machine is moving, or maybe more restrictive, I should say. The judge seems to have regarded turning one method of measurement off and another on as disabling the LLMC. In my respectful submission, that is not a correct construction of the claim or understanding of what's required. Simply moving from one measurement system to another. My Lord Justice Nugee said, does it matter whether you call it one or two systems or one system with two methods? In my submission, it doesn't matter. At all, the whole point is that at all times in Aichi, the longitudinal load moment is being controlled. And the claim requires that control to be disabled. That you do it differently when stationary and moving has no impact at all. You do it differently when stationary and moving because you have different things you're trying to deal with. This is all just engineering. It's not turning it off. And just point out that Aichi, actually, if you read paragraphs 5 and paragraph 11, gives you the same advantage when stationary and moving, because in both paragraphs it says the overturning moment corresponds to the actual load on the work platform. So when you're using the stationary method, you get an overturning moment corresponding to the actual load. And when you use the preferred moving method in Aichi of using the measured load immediately before moving, you get the same advantage. The whole thrust of Aichi, whichever way it moves between stationary and moving, is to have a control system in operation. And there are very good reasons for that. It's a mobile elevated work platform. Safety is absolutely paramount. The idea that you would turn off a control system which keeps the device safe with human beings at high level on the platform is one that no regulatory authority would countenance. That's
so Aichi's dealing with cherry pickers. Do you drive the cherry pickers with personnel on the platform?
Yes, that's the whole point. Is if the personnel on the platform have a control. It's described in, I think, paragraph 4. You get onto the platform and you press the buttons and you pull yourself up and down. You can drive the machine about. If you happen to be in your inn when the workmen are doing it, you will see them, chugging around the inn on the platform, quite frequently, quite high up.
Please tell me you had a go, Mr. Sort.
I'm not that brave. I only did motor racing. Motor racing is much safer. You're close to the ground.
Well, I can tell you that picking fruit in the old-fashioned way on a ladder can be dangerous.
I know. I've done it and I've fallen off.
So have I.
And the doctor I saw when I went to A&E said, at your age, you should know better. And sadly, I think he was right. Anyway, what the text of Aichi shows you is that Aichi's central and overriding objective is to control the overturning moment, whether stationary or moving, which is the complete opposite of what the patent claim is directed to. Now, the judge, I don't think, has properly engaged with this, because the whole point that I was making to you on the evidence was that both experts were agreed that that was the case. And both experts were agreed that the patent doesn't do that. The judge, you put to me certain questions this morning, and I've noticed since answering those questions that actually the judge elides from longitudinal load moment control system to moment limitation without acknowledging that there might be a difference. If you look at paragraph 80 of the judgment, you'll see what we submitted, and this, I think, is in answer to what probably deals with Lord Justice Birss's point. Did you make this point? And the answer is yes, because in 83, the point I made was that the claim requires, and IHE does not disclose, disabling the longitudinal load moment control system. And the judge seems, in the subsequent paragraphs, slightly to have lost sight of that, because he doesn't deal with what the working range control system does at all. He just, at 86, says, well, if you turn off the moment limitation device, it's disabled. That's not an answer to the question that he was asked. Because the question he was asked was, once you've done that, and you switch to the working limitation device, have you disabled the longitudinal load moment indicator control? And he actually hasn't answered that question.
So 86, which Miss Edwards Stewart relied on.
Yeah.
He doesn't say, this is your point, he doesn't say disabled the longitudinal load moment control system. He says disabled the moment limitation device.
Yeah.
Well, I think you don't dispute that.
No.
I think you don't dispute that under Aichi, you switch off the moment limitation bit, whether you call it a device or a system or a mode, doesn't matter, because your point is the control system continues using a different system or a different mode or a different bit.
It's still a longitudinal load moment control system, which is what Professor Plummer says in 634, and which hasn't been challenged. And the judge just seems to, frankly, to have lost sight of what's actually an issue here.
So you say that although he finds disablement in 86, he doesn't find what you asked, what you said he couldn't find, was disabling the LMCS.
The control system.
Yeah.
It can't make any difference whether you use precisely the same methodology when you're stationary and when you're moving, or whether you use different methodologies, if what you are trying to do throughout is control the longitudinal load moment. You're just you're controlling it, so your system is operational, just doing it in a slightly different way. I have checked in response to Lord Justice Birss's questions, and at paragraphs 182 and 183 of our written closing, the case was put as I have put it: disable equals no control system when moving. We can give you copies of the closing arguments, because paragraph 194 of Manitou's closing put the opposite point, and I dealt with that in oral closing. If you'd like copies of all those bits just to see what was said, I can let you have them later today. I think it would help.
Yes.
We'll do that. And as a little sort of preliminary taster, I specifically pointed to what the claim says. When dealing with it, I pointed to what the claim says and paragraph 37 of the specification. So I put exactly the same case to the judge that I've put to you today. And quite frankly, he hasn't properly dealt with it. Now, he clearly thought that Mr. Graham's concessions, if accepted, were helpful to me, because he felt it necessary to say that Mr. Graham didn't understand what he was accepting.
Well, I'm not sure that's right. He introduces this passage at 87 to say JCB argued that he changed his mind.
Yeah.
So,
First of all, that you were making a point that Mr. Graham had given up something or had changed his mind in cross-examination. That's what the judges
Yes, well, what I was saying was that Mr. Graham accepted in cross-examination that there was a control system operating, whether stationary or moving. In and you're controlling, it's the last question and answer at the end of 88. You would control the boom movement, whether stationary or moving, just changing the permitted safe working limit. So the point I was making was that Mr. Crane had accepted that if you applied Aichi to a telehandler, you would not disable the control system when the telehandler was moving, which is what the claim requires.
Well, it's two different. Well, this is the point on construction, isn't it? I mean, does the claim require?
The claim says a control system.
But it also refers to sensing.
Yes, but you can sense either directly by measuring or indirectly by presuming and evaluating. I mean, the point is that if
I get the impression that that point wasn't put to the judge.
I don't think that point featured in the same way as it has as a result of your lordship's questions, because the parties were focused on whether the working range control system was an LMC, I think, and now I'm probably wrong about that. Let me get my head straight round. I certainly don't think that the way you put it to me this morning came out at the trial with the focus that you've put it. But the judge, when you look at the focus with which you put it, I would respectfully submit it is reasonably clear that the judge has not identified, has not understood fully and dealt with, or has not fully dealt with the consequences of switching on the working range control system in Aichi on the way the machine behaves. He simply assumed that it's sufficient to turn off something that's measuring. So what I say...
Maybe he's although he hasn't identified it, he's actually assumed the construction point that you make against you and construed the claim the way your opponent hears.
It is possible, but it would have been a lot clearer if he'd actually said...
Well, you were perfectly entitled to make the point that he doesn't say that. No, I understand.
No. He clearly thought that what Mr. Graham agreed was relevant. So I suspect, because he said he had to reject it, 89. If he had to reject it, he must have thought that if Mr. Graham's concession was correct, the way I was putting the argument to him would succeed. So I suspect the answer is he didn't take the construction point against me. He, in fact, accepted the construction point as I'm putting it, namely, a control system is a control system. It doesn't matter that it may use a slightly different methodology when stationary and moving. If what it's doing is limiting the moment at all times. But I will be perfectly frank, I wouldn't like to be sure. What I say is, the very narrow construction the controller puts on the claim is plainly too narrow. Aichi has a control system which is operational at all times. The claim requires the control system to be turned off. And that is sufficient to distance me from Aichi and make the claim not obvious. There is, at the heart of this, a relatively simple question to answer. Does Aichi turn off the control system when it moves? If it does, it renders the claim obvious. If it doesn't, in my respectful submission, it doesn't render the claim obvious. Unless you have some more questions for me, I think I've probably overstayed my welcome anyway.
No, it's always a pleasure to listen to counsel. We don't have any other questions. Thank you both very much. As you will have guessed, we're unlikely to give a judgment straight away. We will let you have our judgments in due course. They will be circulated in the normal way with a remote hand down, as is now standard practice. And as you know, they come with a fierce embargo, which means what it says. And that will give you an opportunity to correct our spelling and grammar, but not revisit the arguments. and we hope you will be able to agree in order giving effect to whatever our judgments say, or if not, short written submissions, and we will deal with them on paper.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much.
Have you got a phone?
I never have a phone.
Somebody
If I don't
will-
have a phone, then you don't have to worry. It will
some
go off.
kind solicitor